Let's talk about Mike Zimmer and the potential for him to get fired. And here's why. Here's why. Because Bet Online has released its odds of coaches to get fired first. And Mike Zimmer is 5th on this list. And I'm going to start off, just going to make this statement, and then John, you react, and Sam, go forth. I think that there's a little be careful what you wish for with the idea of firing Mike Zimmer if this year is not any more than in the middle. And the reason I say that is because that Zimmer sets a standard of professional head football coaching that you can win with. And if you change that, you might just get someone who is horrible. You can change players and rosters and coaches, and quarterbacks, but there's only so many coaches who know how to do this job. And I think you saw a little bit of this, I don't know, for the entire time you've coached the Wolves, that they've only had a few real professional coaches. So react to that statement, John.
Yeah, I agree with it. I mean, I've kind of said for a long time that there is a floor with Mike Zimmer that's relatively high. And, there is, you can look at some of the development of the draft picks that they've had and just kind of the, like you said, Matthew, like the standard that is being set, that by and large, I mean, you're not going to have embarrassing seasons. You're not going to have just awful years. And maybe you could argue, well, maybe they should have one or two of those so they have a top 5 draft pick and do all that. But in the middle of it, like there's a level of competence with Mike Zimmer that you just know you're going to get year in and year out. What is his ceiling? I guess that's a question that certainly is valid when you're looking at evaluating what he is, because when he gets into the biggest of moments in postseasons and against really good teams, they generally are pretty outclassed. So I think you can evaluate that. But yes, in terms of knowing what you're going to get from a Mike Zimmer coach team, you're going to get discipline, you're going to get competence, you're going to get competitiveness, generally speaking, most of the time. And I think there is value in just being good year in and year out.
So here are the 6 coaches in the league that are longer tenured than Mike Zimmer: John Harbaugh, Andy Reid, Bill Belichick, Sean Payton, Mike Tomlin, and Pete Carroll. What do the 6 of them have in common? They've all won a Super Bowl.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
They've all got at least one Super Bowl. So Mike Zimmer is in somewhat rarefied air, and he's also the one that doesn't belong. Coaches that don't win Super Bowls typically don't last this long, especially coaches that have never won multiple playoff games in the same postseason. That being said, Matthew, when you talk about the scenario of sort of thinking the grass will be greener and then it not being greener, think about the Detroit Lions in the division, who had Jim Caldwell, who went, I just looked this up, 36-28. He was a .563 winning percentage head coach, and they exchanged that for Matt Patricia. And they go into dysfunction zone. They've fired him since. They've got a whole new regime. They've got a rebuild. They've got a quarterback that got so disgruntled he asked for a trade. So that's sort of the low end, right, of what you worry about, for sure. And if the Vikings make a move, I think they're probably compelled to go someone young and someone offensive-minded, and that can be a gamble because a lot of times those type of coaches don't have a lot of track record. You're sort of betting on what they did in college or what they did in 1 or 2 years as a coordinator or a quarterback's coach. There's not a lot of proof there. Whereas, someone like Mike Zimmer came in who had this 3-decade career as a head coach. You kind of knew what you were getting in terms of a defensive mind. So I like that you're being cautionary about it. I would also like to know, Matthew, who were the top 4 on that list on Bet Online that you mentioned?
Okay, hang on. Let me pull this up because I have this. That would be, let's see. No, hold on. Wrong tab. Sorry, this is great. That would be Mike McCarthy, Vic Fangio, Matt Nagy, and John Gruden were all the guys who were before them. So I think that the list is a good list of guys who could be on the hot seat. I don't know if they would can Gruden with the amount of money he's still owed.
Right.
And that might be a factor with Zimmer too, signing that extension last year. But John, I think that Sam makes a really good point about like when teams move on from a defensive coach who's old school, who had been a defensive coordinator for a long time, sort of grizzled and so forth. They always want the young, innovative, this guy knows Sean McVay or something. And you've kind of been through this going from Tibbs to Ryan Saunders, where it's like Tibbs had his flaws as Mike Zimmer has his flaws, but it was like, Saunders, he's the young guy. He's going to shoot threes. Great. And it wasn't great because he didn't know how to coach a basketball team. And I think that that's always the concern when I talk about the grass is greener, like who you're hiring. The sort of setup here would be, they'll hire an offensive genius. And I'm always cautionary about that.
Yeah. I mean, it's really interesting when, looking at those two lists that Sam and Matthew, you both gave us. So the two lists that Mike Zimmer has coupled in, one is with the longest tenured, and that list is unimpeachable great coaches, right? I mean, we all agree, that all of those guys really, really good at what they do. And then, so Zimmer's right on the edge with those guys. But then you go back to the Bet Online, and all of those guys, probably pretty bad coaches. Like, maybe you make an argument for one or two, like, they're not so bad, but they've really not had a lot of success. And then there's Zimmer right on the edge of that one too. And so it's just kind of, you can see how the pendulum can swing pretty wildly when you're looking at Mike Zimmer and his body of work. But you're right in terms of if they do make a move, there's always sort of the overcorrection. There's always defense to offense. Childress was an offensive coach, so we're going defense. Or Leslie Frazier, then Leslie Frazier was an easygoing coach, and then we're going hard-nosed, no nonsense guy. And so I think that it really takes kind of a security in yourself as an ownership group, as a GM, whoever's making the decision, that to not overreact and to really look at a field and say, I'm not going to pigeonhole myself by just because we had kind of more of an old school defensive minded guy, that all of those guys are off the table, that all the defensive guys are off the table. I mean, in general, in the league, everyone's hiring offensive guys just because that's the way the league is built. But to me, I think you really have to fight the urge to just do the massive overcorrection and just like evaluate the field and say, these are the 3 or 4 people that we think are the best. Let's just put them up against each other and make a decision that way. But again, this is all assuming that something like this were to happen. I mean, I think with Zimmer, we talk about the floor that he has and the reason for keeping him around that way. But the other thing you factor in is he's had a couple of players that kind of get tired of him or kind of get disenfranchised, and really, really good players, Stephon Diggs, Danielle Hunter, like, when those kind of things come around, that's when you look at it too. Like, okay, is there something beyond just his coaching ability? Because Tibbs was a really, really good coach. That no one really questioned that, but it was his ability behind the scenes to manage personalities, to do all of the locker room politics, to make that made it him wear out here quickly. And I think that's the thing that I could see, maybe forcing a hand with Zimmer as much as anything else.
Yeah, not much to add to that, John, other than you could make a similar 2 lists for a certain quarterback on this team. A list where you look at the last 6-7 years of statistical data belongs with the elite of the elite. And you could also put him with a top 5 list of quarterbacks set to be replaced either this year or the next year. And I think Kirk Cousins probably belongs in both of those categories as well. And there are similarities between the head coach's situation and the quarterback's situation. And you need cohesiveness in those 2 positions. And right now there's a lot of uncertainty, I think, on both fronts.
Yeah, it's a great point, Sam. Like, Cousins obviously has an entirely different personality than Zimmer, but both guys are exceedingly competent at their jobs. There is a floor with Kirk Cousins as your quarterback in an offense that you're never going to drop below. He's super durable. He's going to be out there. He's going to put up numbers. But then in the biggest of games, when you need him the most, that's when oftentimes he falls flat. And that's the same with Zimmer. Like in the biggest of games, when you need him the most, that defense gets freaking shredded by San Francisco or Philadelphia, or, you know, in these kinds of situations. And so you look at it and you say, okay, like what's our goal here? And do you stay the course and with Cousins and Zimmer? And do you say, we just believe in these guys and we believe the alternatives out there are not going to be any better than we can get right now? Or do you like swing for the fences and say, you know, it's time to, you know, maybe it's Kellen Mond next year. Maybe it's, you know, maybe you bring in the next hot shot offensive coordinator next year and just say, look, we've run our course this way. We have gotten as far as we can go, and we need to go try and get someone who can take us the rest of the way. And if that blows up, well, at least you tried something, and at least you tried something different, and then you kind of go back to square one a little bit.